I didn't lose my daughter all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, the way something precious disappears when you're not looking closely enough. For most of my life, I was a woman who believed in building things that lasted. Not just houses, but people, family, stability. My name is Magdalene Carson. I'm 62 years old, and this happened in Atlanta, Georgia. I worked as a property manager for nearly 3 decades. Long hours, difficult tenants, endless paperwork. But I understood value. Not just market value. Emotional value. Security. Ownership. Legacy. And everything I built for one person. My daughter, Lila. Lila was born on a humid August evening, the kind where the air feels thick enough to hold on to. I remember holding her for the first time, thinking how small she felt in my arms, and how big the responsibility already was. Her father passed away when she was 7. A sudden heart condition. No warning. No time to prepare. Just one day he was there. And the next, I was standing in a hospital hallway trying to understand how I was supposed to raise a child alone. From that moment on, everything became about survival and sacrifice. I took extra shifts, declined promotions that required travel, turned down relationships because I didn't want strangers coming in and out of Lila's life. I learned how to stretch money, how to fix things myself, how to hide exhaustion behind a steady voice. And I made sure of one thing. Lila would never feel like she had less. I bought the house when she was 12. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy. But it was ours. I still remember the first night we moved in. Boxes everywhere. No curtains yet. Just the soft orange glow from the streetlights slipping through the windows. Lila ran from room to room, laughing, claiming spaces as if she had just discovered a kingdom. "This one's mine," she shouted, standing in what would become her bedroom. I leaned against the doorway, watching her, smiling, because that moment, that feeling, that was why I worked so hard. For years, things were simple. Not easy, but simple. We had routines, we had traditions. Friday night dinners. Sunday morning pancakes. Late night talks about school, friends, dreams. She told me everything back then. Everything. The change didn't come suddenly. It never does. It started with small things. Missed calls. Shorter conversations. A shift in tone. Then came college. Then marriage. And somewhere between those milestones, I stopped being part of her life and started becoming an obligation. Her husband, Derek, was polite when we first met. Too polite. The kind of politeness that feels rehearsed. Measured. Like he was always calculating the right thing to say. I ignored it. Because Lila was happy. And that was enough for me. When they got married, I made a decision that, at the time, felt like love. I let them move into the house. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. I simply said, "It's yours to build your life in." I didn't think about paperwork. Didn't think about titles or legalities. Because this was my daughter. And I trusted her. For a while it worked. Family dinners came back. Laughter returned to the walls. And when Noah was born, everything felt whole again. My grandson, Noah. He had Lila's eyes when she was a child. Curious. Bright. Full of wonder. He would run into my arms every time I visited. "Grandma," he'd shout, like I was the most important person in the world. And for those moments, I believed I still was. But over the last 3 years, something shifted. Again. Only this time it was sharper. Colder. More deliberate. Visits became scheduled. Not invited. Scheduled. Calls were shorter. Then less frequent. Then almost non-existent. And when we did speak, there was an edge in Lila's voice. Subtle. But there. Like she was always slightly irritated. Slightly distant. Slightly done. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was calling too much. Maybe I was showing up too often. Maybe I was holding on too tightly. So I pulled back. Gave space. Waited for her to reach out. She didn't. Not until she needed something. And that's how it became. Every interaction had a purpose. A reason. A request. Usually involving Noah. "Mom, can you watch him for a few hours?" "Mom, I have a meeting, can you come over?" "Mom, just for today, please." I never said no. Not once. Because no matter how distant Lila became, Noah never changed. He still ran into my arms. Still smiled the same way. Still made me feel like I belonged. Then came the call. The one that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon. I remember because I had just finished organizing some old property files. Habit, I suppose. Even in retirement, I liked things in order. My phone rang. Lila's name. I stared at it for a second longer than usual before answering. Hello. Her voice came softer than I expected. Hi, Mom. There was a pause. Small, but noticeable. I need a favor. Of course you do, I thought. But I didn't say it. All right, I replied calmly. What is it? Another pause. Longer this time. Then, can you babysit Noah tonight? I exhaled quietly. Of course. Then she added something. Something that didn't sit right. Not immediately, but enough to linger. Just one last time. I didn't respond right away. Because something about those words felt wrong. Final. Too final. What do you mean? I asked. Oh, nothing like that, she said quickly. Too quickly. I just mean we're trying to get into a more structured routine. Less reliance on, outside help. Outside help. I let that settle. Didn't challenge it. Didn't question it. Because sometimes when you push, you lose what little access you still have. All right, I said finally. What time? 6, she replied. And Mom? Yes. Another pause. Then, thank you. The call ended. And I sat there for a long moment, staring at my phone. Because something about that conversation didn't feel like a request. It felt like a closing. Still, at 5:45 p.m., I was at the house. The same house I bought 20 years ago. The same front door. The same porch light. But standing there that evening, it felt different. Lila opened the door. Derek was behind her, already dressed. Formal. Rushed. Hi, she said, stepping aside. Hi, I replied. No hug. Not anymore. Noah ran toward me from the living room. Grandma. I knelt down, catching him as he crashed into my arms. And just like that, everything else faded. For a moment. His dinner's in the fridge, Lila said quickly. Bedtime at 8. He's already had his bath. I nodded. Routine instructions. Efficient. Detached. We won't be late, Derek added. I glanced at him briefly. Something about the way he said it didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like dismissal. Take your time, I said. They left quickly. Too quickly. The door closed behind them with a soft but final click. And suddenly, the house felt different. I stood there for a moment, holding Noah's hand. Listening. Not to anything specific. Just listening. The silence felt heavier than usual. The air still. The space. Unfamiliar. I walked into the living room slowly. Everything was clean. Perfectly arranged. Almost staged. No clutter. No warmth. No signs of lived-in comfort. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place being prepared. For what? I didn't know yet. But I would. Soon enough. That night wasn't just the last time I babysat. It was the night I realized I had been slowly erased from my own family. And the night I would discover they had already made plans to finish it. There's a moment when something shifts. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for your instincts to whisper. Pay attention. That was how the night unfolded. Quiet. Controlled. Almost too smooth. After Lila and Derek left, Noah pulled me toward the living room with the kind of excitement only a child can have over something simple. Grandma, look. I built a tower. Bright plastic blocks stacked unevenly on the rug. I smiled and knelt beside him. That's impressive, I said, steadying the structure before it collapsed. He laughed. That same laugh. The one that still made everything feel normal. For the next hour, I let myself exist in that small bubble. We played. We ate. I warmed his dinner, carefully labeled, pre-portioned, efficient. Everything about it felt organized. Not nurturing. Just managed. Mommy says we're moving soon, Noah said suddenly between bites. My hand paused midair. Moving? I repeated gently. He nodded, not sensing the weight of what he'd just said. Yeah, Daddy said it's going to be a bigger house. With a pool. I forced a small smile. That sounds exciting. But inside, something tightened. Lila hadn't mentioned anything about moving. Not once. Not in passing. Not casually. Nothing. When did they tell you that? I asked. Noah shrugged. Yesterday. Mommy said not to tell anyone yet. I felt it then. Clear. Sharp. Intentional. Not just distance. Not just coldness. Secrecy. I didn't press further. Children aren't meant to carry adult truths. But I filed it away. Quietly. Carefully. By 7:45 p.m., I started getting Noah ready for bed. He brushed his teeth with exaggerated focus, humming softly. The kind of moment that feels small, until you realize later it was one of the last times things felt simple. Will you still come over tomorrow? He asked as I tucked him in. The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I answered honestly. Why? He looked at me for a second, then said something that didn't sound like his words. They said today is the last time. The room felt colder. Who said that? I asked quietly. Mommy. I didn't respond immediately. I just adjusted his blanket, smoothed his hair, kissed his forehead. Get some sleep, sweetheart. He closed his eyes within minutes. Children always do. They trust the world hasn't changed, even when it already has. I stepped out of the room slowly, leaving the door slightly open. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound. Not from inside the house, but from the baby monitor sitting on the counter. Static. Then, a voice. Derek. I froze. Completely still. I told you we should have waited, he said. His voice was low, irritated. Not the polite tone he used around me. This was different. Real. Lila responded. She's already suspicious, she said. Dragging it out won't make it easier. My grip tightened slightly around the glass. Suspicious? We just need tonight to go smoothly, Derek continued. After that, it's done. My heart slowed. Not sped up. Slowed. The way it does when your body is trying to process something it doesn't want to believe. Lila sighed. I know. That's why I said one last time. The words echoed. One last time. I stepped closer to the monitor without thinking, as if proximity would somehow change what I was hearing. She's not going to take it well, Derek said. There was a pause. Then Lila answered. And her voice. It wasn't conflicted. It wasn't emotional. It was resolved. She'll get over it. Something inside me shifted. Not broken. Not yet. But moved. We've done enough, she continued. She's been helpful. But this isn't her life anymore. Helpful. Not mother. Not family. Not someone who built everything she was standing on. Just helpful. Derek chuckled softly. Temporary, he said. Temporary. I didn't realize I had stopped breathing until my chest tightened. She's too attached, Lila added. And it's starting to feel suffocating. That word landed harder than anything else. Because for years, I had pulled back, given space, stayed quiet, so I wouldn't become exactly that. Suffocating. We just need to finalize everything, Derek said. Once the paperwork is done, she won't have any reason to come back here again. Finalize. Paperwork. No reason to come back. The pieces started forming. Not fully. Not clearly. But enough to understand one thing. This wasn't emotional distance. This was a plan. Lila spoke again. Quieter this time. But clearer. She won't fight it, she said. She never does. And that was the moment something inside me didn't just shift. It straightened. Because she was right. I hadn't fought. Not when she pulled away. Not when she reduced our conversations. Not when I became convenient. But this wasn't distance. This was erasure. And I was just hearing about it by accident. Derek's voice returned. We'll talk to her next week. Make it clean. Boundaries. No confusion. Clean. As if I were something to be removed. Lila exhaled slowly. Good, she said. I just want this to be over. Over. The line went silent. I stood there in the kitchen. Still. Glass untouched in my hand. The monitor humming softly again. The house around me felt different now. Not unfamiliar. Not staged. Occupied. Not by family. But by something colder. More calculated. I looked around slowly. At the counters. The cabinets. The walls. Everything I had built. Everything I had paid for. Everything I had trusted them to take care of. And suddenly, it didn't feel like I was visiting. It felt like I had been replaced. Not emotionally. Legally. I set the glass down carefully, walked to the living room, then back toward the hallway. My steps were quieter now. Measured. Because for the first time that night, I wasn't just reacting. I was thinking. And as I stood there, listening to the silence settle again, one question rose clearly above everything else. What exactly are they finalizing? I didn't know yet. But I would. Because whatever they were planning, they believed I had no power in it. And that assumption was about to become their biggest mistake. I didn't sleep that night. Not even for a minute. After the voices on the monitor faded and the house returned to its carefully curated silence, I stayed exactly where I was for a long time. Not frozen. Not afraid. Just still. Letting everything I had heard settle into something I could understand. Because what I felt wasn't shock. Not entirely. It was recognition. When you spend decades managing properties, negotiating contracts, reviewing agreements, you develop a certain instinct. You learn to hear what people say. And more importantly, what they don't. Finalize everything. Paperwork. Clean break. Those weren't emotional words. They were legal ones. And that meant one thing. This wasn't just about pushing me out of their lives. This was about structure. Ownership. Control. I turned off the kitchen light and walked slowly into the living room. The house felt different now. Not cold. Not empty. But detached. Like I was walking through a space that had already been mentally reassigned to someone else. I sat down on the edge of the couch. The same couch I had picked out years ago. I could still remember Lila complaining about the color. "It's too plain, Mom." I had laughed back then. Plain lasts longer. I let out a quiet breath. Funny how things circle back. My eyes moved around the room. Everything in place. Nothing out of order. But now, I wasn't seeing comfort. I was seeing preparation. Minimal personal items. No framed photos of me. No signs of history. Just a present they had redesigned. Carefully. Deliberately. I stood up again. Slowly this time. And began to walk. Not wandering. Inspecting. Through the hallway. Past Noah's room. Toward the master bedroom. I didn't enter. I didn't need to. Because whatever I was looking for wouldn't be obvious. People like Derek don't leave plans in plain sight. They hide them in structure. In systems. In paperwork. I turned instead toward the small office space near the back of the house. A room that used to be mine. Years ago. Before I handed over more than just keys. The door was slightly open. The light inside was off. I pushed it gently. Inside, the room had changed. Of course it had. Different desk. Different layout. Different purpose. But one thing hadn't changed. The cabinet. Metal. Locked. Placed against the far wall. I walked toward it without hesitation. Not because I knew something was inside, but because I knew that if anything mattered, it would be stored, not displayed. I pulled the handle. Locked. Expected. I stepped back. Looked around. Desk drawers. Shelves. Nothing obvious. Then I noticed something small. Almost insignificant. A key. Placed carelessly in a shallow tray on the desk. Mixed in with pens, receipts, loose items. That told me everything I needed to know. They didn't think they needed to hide it. Because they didn't think I would look. I picked it up slowly. Walked back to the cabinet. Inserted it. Turned. Click. The sound felt louder than it should have. I opened the cabinet. Inside. Files. Organized. Labeled. I exhaled slowly. Of course. Derek was meticulous. I had noticed that from the beginning. Not emotionally expressive, but structurally precise. I began scanning the labels. Tax documents. Insurance. Property maintenance. Routine. Expected. Then, a folder. Unlabeled. That was the one. Because people who organize everything only leave something unlabeled when they don't want it noticed. I pulled it out. Placed it on the desk. Opened it. The first page was enough. A legal document. Draft format. I read the header once. Then again. Slower. Property transfer agreement. My fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. I kept reading. The address. This house. The names. Lila Mercer. Derek Halston. And then, A section labeled, Primary Owner Consent, blank. But below it, attached, a copy, a scanned version of a document I recognized immediately, because it had once been real. My signature. But not on that document. On something else. Something older. Something unrelated. They had taken it, lifted it, reused it, and placed it into a context where it didn't belong. I felt something shift again. Not pain. Not anger. Something colder. Clarity. Because now I understood the full shape of it. This wasn't just a plan to distance themselves. This was an attempt to transfer ownership. Without me. And they had already started. I flipped to the next page. Correspondence. Emails. Printed. Between Derek and a legal contact. Discussions about expediting the process. About minimizing resistance. About ensuring compliance appears voluntary. I stopped there. Closed my eyes briefly. Not because I couldn't continue, but because I didn't need to read further to understand. They weren't asking. They weren't preparing for a conversation. They were preparing for execution. And in their version of events, I was already out. I placed the document back down carefully. Not disturbed. Not wrinkled. Exactly as it had been. Because this wasn't the moment to confront. This was the moment to think. I closed the folder. Returned it to the cabinet. Locked it. Placed the key back exactly where I found it. Every movement precise. Measured. Controlled. Because now, everything mattered. I stepped out of the office. Closed the door gently behind me. The house was quiet again. No different than before. But I was. I walked back to the living room. Sat down slowly. And let the reality settle fully. They believed 3 things. That I didn't know. That I wouldn't fight. That legally. I had no ground. They were wrong. Because there was one thing they hadn't confirmed. One detail they had assumed. One step they thought was already complete. Ownership. Years ago, when Lila got married, I had considered transferring the house. Fully. Completely. But something had stopped me. Not suspicion. Not fear. Just instinct. So I delayed it. Left things as they were. Told myself I would finalize it later. I never did. Which meant one simple, undeniable truth remained. The house was still mine. Entirely. And everything they were building, every document, every assumption, every plan, was sitting on a foundation that didn't exist. I leaned back slightly. Not in relief. Not yet. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. They had already moved forward. Already involved legal channels. Already created a version of reality where I was no longer part of the equation. And people like Derek don't make moves like that unless they believe they've covered every angle. Which meant there was more. More documents. More actions. More steps already in motion. And if I was going to respond, I needed to understand all of it. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. But completely. Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about making sure. They could never try this again. I looked around the house one more time. The walls. The space. The silence. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like I had just uncovered something. Something they never expected me to find. And now, the only question left was, how far they were willing to go. Before they realized, they had already lost. I left the house that night without waking Noah. That was the hardest part. I stood at his doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching him sleep. One arm flung over his head, his breathing soft and even, completely untouched by the quiet war unfolding around him. Children don't see strategy. They don't see betrayal. They just feel presence. And I had a feeling. Mine was about to be taken away. I closed his door gently and walked out of the house with the same calm I had walked in with. No hesitation. No confrontation. No sign that anything had changed. Because everything had. The drive home felt longer than usual. Not because of distance, but because my mind wasn't racing. It was organizing. That's something most people misunderstand about moments like this. They expect panic, emotion, outbursts. But when you've spent years solving problems, managing risk, reading between lines, you don't react. You assess. By the time I got home, I already knew 2 things. Lila and Derek believed I was unaware. They were already too deep into their plan to stop, which meant I had one advantage: time, and I intended to use it properly. The next morning, I woke up at exactly 6 a.m. Habit, routine, control. I made coffee, sat at the same table I had sat at for years, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't think about my daughter as family. I thought about her as a variable, and variables can be managed. By 8:30 a.m., I made the first call. "Martin, it's Magdalene." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a familiar voice. Older now, but still sharp. "Well, I wasn't expecting to hear from you this early," he said. "Everything all right?" "No," I replied calmly. "But it will be." Martin Cole had been a colleague of mine years ago before transitioning fully into real estate law. Meticulous, patient, and most importantly, he didn't miss details. "I need you to review something," I continued. Quietly, his tone shifted immediately. "Send it." "I won't send it," I said. "I'll bring it in." Another pause. Short. Understanding. "All right," he said. "Come by at 10. I ended the call, finished my coffee, and began pulling out documents I hadn't touched in years. Property records, purchase agreements, tax filings, ownership confirmations. Everything was still there, exactly as I had left it. Because unlike emotions, paper doesn't forget. By the time I arrived at Martin's office, I wasn't uncertain anymore. I was prepared. He reviewed everything in silence. No interruptions. No commentary. Just the quiet flipping of pages and the occasional adjustment of his glasses. Finally, he looked up. "Did you sign anything recently?" he asked. "No." "Authorize any transfer?" "No." "Grant power of attorney?" "Never." He leaned back slightly. Exhaled. "Then this is straightforward," he said. I didn't respond. I waited. "The property is still entirely in your name," he continued. "No partial transfer. No co-ownership. No legal claim from anyone else. Simple. Clear. Undeniable. And if someone attempted to initiate a transfer without your consent?" I asked. His expression hardened slightly. "Then they're either incompetent," he said, "or they're relying on deception." I held his gaze. "They used an old signature," I said. "From a different document. That got his full attention." "That's not just invalid," he said slowly. "That's actionable." There it was. Not emotional. Not personal. Legal. I nodded once. "What about attempted filings?" I asked. He turned back to the documents, scanning quickly. "They've started preliminary work," he said. "But nothing here is finalized. No official transfer has gone through. No registration changes." I let out a quiet breath. Not relief. Confirmation. "They think it's already theirs," I said. Martin looked at me carefully. "And what do you want to do about it?" That question was more important than it sounded, because this wasn't just about stopping them. It was about deciding how far I was willing to go. I didn't answer immediately. I looked down at the documents. At my name. At the years behind it. Then I said it. Calmly. Clearly. "I want them to finish." He frowned slightly. "Finish what?" "Their plan," I said. "I want them to believe it's complete. That everything has gone through. That they've succeeded." Martin studied me for a moment. Then, very slowly, he nodded. "That can be arranged. Because people like Martin understand something most don't. Sometimes the strongest position is letting the other side expose themselves fully. They've already crossed into risky territory," he added. "If they push further, it strengthens your case." "Good," I said. No hesitation. Because this was no longer about protecting myself. It was about making sure they couldn't pretend this was a misunderstanding later. No confusion. No miscommunication. No emotional rewriting of events. Just facts. Martin closed the folder. "I'll prepare everything," he said. "Documentation, legal position, potential actions." I stood up. Collected my things. "Don't contact them," he added. "Let them come to you." I gave a small nod. "They will. Because people who believe they've won always come forward." I left his office with something I hadn't felt the night before. Not anger. Not sadness. Control. The next few days were quiet. Almost unsettlingly so. No calls from Lila. No messages. No updates. And that told me everything. They were moving forward. Confidently. Without hesitation. Exactly as planned. On the fourth day, the message came. Mom, can you come by on Saturday? We need to talk. There it was. I read it once. Then again. No warmth. No explanation. No attempt to soften what was coming. Just, we need to talk. I replied simply. Of course. And that was it. No more messages. No follow-up. Because in her mind, this was already decided. Saturday came faster than expected. I arrived at the house at exactly 11 a.m. Not early. Not late. On time. Lila opened the door. Derek stood behind her. The air inside felt different again. Not staged. Prepared. There was a folder on the table. Papers neatly arranged. Pens aligned. Everything about the setup told me one thing. They believed this was a formality. Not a discussion. An execution. Come in, Lila said. I stepped inside. Calm. Composed. Because the truth was, they had no idea that I had already seen everything. And more importantly, they had no idea that I had already decided how this would end. I didn't sit immediately. That was the first thing I changed. In the past, I would have walked in, smiled politely, taken whatever seat they offered, and waited to be told why I was there. Not this time. This time, I walked in slowly, deliberately, and let my eyes take in everything before I made a move. The dining table was set like a negotiation room. 3 chairs. 3 positions. Except it wasn't a negotiation. They had already decided that. The folder sat in the center. Neatly arranged documents. Tabs. Markers. Prepared. Derek's doing. Lila stood near the head of the table. Not beside me. Not across from me. Above. A subtle shift in positioning. But intentional. Mom, she said, her voice controlled. Thank you for coming. I nodded once. Still standing. You said we needed to talk. Derek stepped forward slightly. Took over. Of course he did. We'll keep this straightforward, he said. No greeting. No courtesy. No attempt at warmth. Straight to structure. Good. That made it easier. We've been discussing our long-term plans, he continued, gesturing lightly toward the folder. And we've come to a decision regarding the house. The house. Not your home. Not our home. The house. I pulled out a chair slowly and sat down. Crossed my hands gently in front of me. Go on, I said. Lila sat opposite me. Not beside me. Opposite. We've decided to move forward independently, she said. Independently. Another carefully chosen word. We found a new property, Derek added. Bigger. Better suited for our future. I nodded once. That's good, I said calmly. Congratulations. They weren't expecting that. I could see it in the brief flicker across Lila's face. They expected resistance. Emotion. Questions. But I gave them none. Derek cleared his throat slightly. Adjusted. With that in mind, he continued, we need to finalize ownership here. There it was. Not discuss. Not review. Finalize. He slid the folder toward me. These documents formalize the transition, he said. It ensures everything is properly aligned and avoids complications moving forward. I didn't touch the folder immediately. Instead, I looked at him, then at Lila, and asked the one question that forced them to say it clearly. Transition from who to who? Silence. Brief. Uncomfortable. Then Lila answered. From you to us. There it was. Clean. Direct. And completely built on a lie. I reached for the folder. Opened it slowly. Every page exactly as I had seen it. Prepared. Organized. Fraud disguised as process. You've already started this, I said, flipping a page. Derek didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Preliminary steps. Nothing binding until you sign. That part was true. Technically. And this signature? I asked, tapping the copied document. Lila leaned forward slightly. That's just reference, she said quickly. To streamline the process. Streamline. I almost smiled. They really believed I didn't understand what I was looking at. I closed the folder gently. Placed both hands on top of it. And if I don't sign? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Because this wasn't part of the version they had rehearsed. Derek answered. Carefully. Then we'll need to revisit how things move forward, he said. Vague. Calculated. What does that mean? I pressed. Lila exhaled sharply, her patience thinning. It means, Mom, she said, that this situation isn't working anymore. There it was again. Not family. Not relationship. Situation. You're too involved, she continued. Too present. It's affecting how we live. Affecting. I held her gaze. I come when you call, I said calmly. That's the problem, she snapped. The room shifted. Because for the first time, she wasn't controlled. You're always available, she continued. Always around. It feels like we never actually got to build our own life. I let her finish. Didn't interrupt. Because people reveal more when they believe they're finally being honest. We need space, she added. Real space. Boundaries. Boundaries. So the solution, I said slowly, is to take the house. It's not like that, she said quickly. But Derek didn't correct it. Because it was exactly like that. This is practical, he said. Clean. Everyone moves forward without conflict. Clean. I leaned back slightly. Studied them both. You've already decided, I said. Yes, Lila replied. No hesitation this time. And you expected me to agree. Another pause. Then. Yes. Honest. At least now. I nodded slowly. Then asked the question they hadn't prepared for. When were you going to tell me I couldn't come back? Silence. Real silence this time. Because that part, they hadn't planned to say out loud. We weren't going to say it like that, Derek said carefully. But that's what it is, I replied. Neither of them argued. Because truth, when stated plainly, doesn't need debate. I looked down at the folder again. Then back at them. You've put a lot of work into this, I said. Derek straightened slightly. Almost defensive. We wanted to handle it properly. Properly. I nodded once. You're right, I said. That caught them off guard. Completely. Properly matters, I continued. Structure matters. Documentation matters. I pushed the folder slightly back toward them. But there's one problem. They both leaned in. Subtly. Because now, they were listening. This only works, I said calmly, if the foundation is real. Derek frowned slightly. What do you mean? I held his gaze. Then Lila's. And said it clearly. The house isn't yours to take. Silence. Confusion first. Then resistance. That's not what the documents show, Derek said quickly. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied. That's what your documents assume. Lila leaned forward. Tension rising. Mom, we've already verified. No, I cut in gently. You verified what you wanted to see. Derek's expression hardened. We've done due diligence, he said. Not enough, I replied. And then, I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table. Original. Stamped. Undeniable. Property ownership. My name. Alone. No additions. No transfers. No shared rights. Nothing. The room changed instantly. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because in one move, everything they had built collapsed. Lila picked up the document. Her hands unsteady now. This isn't right, she said. But her voice didn't believe it. Derek grabbed it next. Read it faster. More aggressively. No, he muttered. There must be. There isn't, I said calmly. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because this wasn't an argument anymore. It was reality. I leaned forward slightly. Just enough. You tried to remove me from something I never gave away, I said. Neither of them spoke. You built a plan, I continued, on an assumption you never confirmed. Derek's jaw tightened. Lila looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the first time in years, she didn't see someone who would step back. She saw someone who wouldn't. You can't do this, she said quietly. I held her gaze. I'm not doing anything, I replied. Then I stood up. Slowly. You are. I picked up my bag. Walked toward the door. And just before I stepped out, I stopped. Not to argue. Not to explain. Just to make one thing clear. You said this was the last time, I said without turning. A pause. Now you're right. And then I left. Not as someone being pushed out, but as someone who had just taken everything back. And they knew it. Because for the first time since they started this, They weren't in control anymore. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat in the car, engine off, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the front door through the windshield. Not waiting. Observing. Because moments like that, right after the truth lands, that's when people reveal who they really are. The door opened less than a minute later. Derek stepped out first. Phone already in his hand. Agitated. Moving fast. Lila followed. Slower. Unsteady. They didn't look at each other. Didn't speak. That told me everything. This wasn't just a failed plan. It was a fracture. Derek paced along the driveway, speaking sharply into the phone. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. His posture said enough. Damage control. Lila stood near the door, arms folded tightly across her chest. Not angry. Not yet. Shaken. Because for the first time, she had to confront something she had convinced herself wasn't possible. That I had boundaries. And worse, that I understood exactly what they had tried to do. I started the car then. Not because I was done, but because this phase was. The emotional confrontation? That was never the real battle. The real battle was what came next. 3 days later. They didn't call. No apology. No explanation. No attempt to fix things. Which confirmed what I already knew. They weren't sorry. They were regrouping. And people like Derek don't walk away from something like that without trying a different angle. On the third day, the letter arrived. Not a message. Not a call. A letter. Formal. Typed. Delivered through a legal firm. I sat at the same table I had sat at days earlier and opened it without hesitation. Notice of intent to establish residency and beneficial interest. I read the title once. Then again. A different strategy. If they couldn't take ownership directly, they would attempt to establish claim through occupancy. Contribution. Time. It was weaker. Less direct. But still dangerous if left unchallenged. I finished reading the letter and set it down carefully. Then I smiled. Because this told me something important. They were no longer operating from strength. They were reacting. And reaction is always slower than preparation. I picked up my phone and called Martin. They've escalated, I said simply. He didn't sound surprised. Send it over, he replied. I'll bring it in, I said again. Because this wasn't something I trusted to distance. An hour later, I was back in his office. He read the letter. Quietly. Then leaned back. This won't hold, he said. I know, I replied. But it can delay things, he added. Complicate them. I nodded. I don't want delay, I said. I want resolution. He studied me for a moment. And how far are you willing to go? That question again. Only this time. I didn't need to think about it. All the way, I said. Because this was no longer just about a house. This was about intent. They didn't just want independence. They didn't just want space. They tried to remove me. Completely. And if I allowed even a fraction of that to stand, it wouldn't end here. Martin nodded slowly. Then we act decisively, he said. And that's exactly what we did. The notice. 2 days later. They received it. A formal legal notice. Clear. Direct. Undeniable. Vacate the property within 30 days. No ambiguity. No negotiation. No emotional language. Just law. I didn't deliver it personally. I didn't call. I didn't explain. Because at this point, there was nothing left to explain. The call. It came that evening. Lila. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. Mom, what is this? She asked, her voice already breaking. I didn't respond immediately. Because tone matters. Timing matters. This, I said calmly, is the consequence of what you tried to do. We weren't trying to, she started. Yes, I cut in gently. You were. Silence. Then. We just needed space, she said, weaker now. Then you should have asked for space, I replied. Not this. Not deception. Not removal. You're kicking us out, she whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. Because that word, us, came too late. You made it clear this wasn't my home anymore, I said. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, I replied. Another silence. Longer this time. And then, the shift. What about Noah? She asked. There it was. The only leverage she believed still existed. I exhaled slowly. What about him? I asked. He lives here, she said. This is his home. I let that settle. Because now, we were no longer talking about documents. We were talking about consequences. He lives where you choose to live, I said calmly. Not here. Not anymore. You're punishing him for something we did, she said. No, I replied. I'm correcting something you tried to do. The distinction mattered, even if she refused to see it. Mom, please, she said, her voice breaking fully now. We can fix this. I didn't respond immediately, because this was the moment most people soften, the moment they step back, the moment they undo everything they've just enforced. But I didn't. Fix what? I asked quietly. She hesitated, because she didn't have an answer. Not a real one, just regret. And regret comes after intention. You tried to take something that wasn't yours, I continued. And you did it without even speaking to me. I was going to tell you. When? I asked. Silence. Because there was no answer. Only timing that benefited them. I gave you everything, I said. Not emotionally. Factually. And you reduced me to an inconvenience. Her breathing was uneven now. I didn't mean. I know, I said. And I did. She didn't mean to hurt me. She just didn't care enough not to. And that was worse. I'll give you time, I added. 30 days. A pause. That's more than you gave me. I ended the call before she could respond. 2 weeks later. They hadn't moved out yet. Of course not. People hold on, even when they know it's over. But something had changed. The house was quieter, less controlled, less confident. Because now, every day they stayed, was a reminder, not of what they had, but of what they lost. And I wasn't done yet. Because the house was never the end game. Respect was. And before this ended, they were going to understand exactly what they had thrown away. They moved out on the 29th day, not the 30th. That detail mattered, because it told me something simple. They waited as long as they could, but not long enough to be forced. I wasn't there when they left. I chose not to be. Some endings don't need witnesses. But I arrived later that evening, just before sunset. The house looked different. Not empty, not abandoned, but stripped. The small things were gone. The things that made it feel lived in. Noah's shoes by the door. The faint chalk marks near the side wall. The extra cup always left near the sink. Gone. I stepped inside slowly. The air felt heavier. Not emotionally. Structurally. Like something that had been stretched too far had finally snapped back into place. I walked through each room without rushing. Living room. Kitchen. Hallway. Everything was intact. No damage. No chaos. Derek wouldn't allow that. Even in retreat. He would want control. But control isn't always about what you leave behind. Sometimes, it's about what you think you're taking with you. I stopped at Noah's room last. The door was open. The bed neatly made. Closet cleared. No trace of him. And that was the only moment I paused. Because that absence, that silence, that was the only part of this I hadn't hardened myself against. I stepped in, walked to the window, looked out at the small yard where he used to run in uneven circles, laughing at nothing in particular. Children don't understand displacement. They just feel the shift. And for a brief second, I wondered what he had been told, what version of me they had given him. Then I let the thought go, because the truth has a way of reaching people eventually, even if it takes time. I turned and walked out of the room, closed the door gently behind me, and just like that, the house was mine again, completely. But this time, it didn't feel the same, not because of loss, but because of clarity. 1 week later, I didn't reach out, not to Lila, not to Derek, because there was nothing left to say. They had made their choices. I had made mine. And distance, real distance, had finally been established. Then the message came. Not from Lila. From an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. A photo. Noah. Sitting on what looked like a moving box. Holding one of his toys. Looking smaller than I remembered. Below it, a single message. He keeps asking for you. I didn't need to ask who it was. Lila. Reaching out without saying her name. Careful. Measured. Just like before. I looked at the photo again. Longer this time. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to conflict. Not doubt, but wait. Because this was the part that wasn't clean. Children never are. I set the phone down. Didn't respond immediately. Because if I did, I would be stepping back into something that had already been defined. And I wasn't going to do that. Not again. An hour passed. Then 2. Then I picked up the phone. And replied. He can come see me. That was it. No apology. No reopening of doors. No return to what was. Just a boundary. Clear. If she wanted access, it would no longer be on her terms. 2 days later, the doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. On time. I opened the door. Lila stood there. No makeup. No composure. No control. And beside her, Noah. He saw me first. And ran. No hesitation. No confusion. Just recognition. Grandma. I knelt down just in time to catch him. Held him tightly. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. Not forgiven. Not forgotten. But set aside. Because some connections don't break the way others do. They bend. They stretch. But they remain. I stood up slowly, still holding his hand. And looked at Lila. Really looked at her. She didn't speak immediately. Because this wasn't the same position she had been in before. She wasn't in control anymore. Not of the space. Not of the terms. I didn't know what else to do, she said quietly. I nodded once. That's new, I replied. She flinched slightly. Because she understood what I meant. For the first time, she didn't have a plan. Just consequences. I'm not asking to come back, she added quickly. Good. Because that wasn't an option. She hesitated, then continued. I don't want him to lose you. I looked down at Noah, still holding my hand. He won't, I said. And I meant it. But not in the way she hoped. Because this time, the connection would be defined properly. Not through convenience. Not through control. But through respect. I stepped aside slightly. You can bring him on weekends, I said. Not an invitation. A structure. She nodded quickly. Thank you. I didn't respond to that. Because gratitude didn't undo intent. But it acknowledged reality. And that was enough. She turned to leave. Then stopped. I'm sorry, she said. I believed her. But belief doesn't restore position. I know, I replied. And that was all she got. She walked away slowly. Not defeated. But changed. Because for the first time in her life, she had encountered something she couldn't manipulate. Finality. I closed the door gently. Looked down at Noah. Can we build a tower? He asked. I smiled faintly. Yes, I said. Let's build something that actually stands this time. And as we walked back into the living room, I realized something simple. They thought this was about a house. About ownership. About space. But what they lost was something far more difficult to rebuild. Trust. And unlike property, that doesn't transfer back.